Hey folks, my name is Alan N and my website is posted in the top left corner, navamsha.com. This is kind of a long overdue discussion of the whole Russia-Ukraine war. I did a post on it back the 1st of March on my website, talking about some of this, but I thought I'd take another crack at it in light of other developments since that time. So think back on February 24th when Russia, attacked Ukraine without provocation, lest we need be reminded. Um, the attack appeared to be launched around 4:30 in the morning in the area of Kharkiv, Ukraine. The Ukrainian cabinet, Zelensky and his principal officers, were briefed on the commencement of the attack around 5 o'clock in the morning. Putin went on national state television at 5 to 6 of that morning, and declared that so-called quote unquote special military operation had begun, ostensibly to relieve Ukraine of a nest of Nazis. So then the war began, and as we all know by now, Russia attempted to quickly take Kharkiv and intended to take Kiev as well too, and basically perform a decapitation of the Ukrainian government. Kill or capture Zelensky and his principal officers, and set up a puppet regime, and eventually take Ukraine for their own. Well, this, in hindsight, certainly it seems to have been poorly planned, because we see the Russian military is hardly up to the task by almost any measure, whether at the command structure, soldiers on the ground, even their military equipment. Everything is pretty much failing badly since that date. Um, Need we wonder why? There was obviously no Vedic astrologer available to establish a muhurta for this particular campaign launch, because once I go to that in a moment, you'll see how miserable that particular onset chart appears. So from the Vedic perspective, needless to say, let's take a look at that. Okay, so here is the chart for the launch of the Russia-Ukraine war. February 24th, 2022, 4:30 in the morning, and I located it in Kharkiv, Ukraine, because that was probably where the first bombardments began. So we have here Sagittarius rising. Um, So this is interesting in so many ways, and problematic in so many ways as well too. Note first that it is a Kala Sarpa configuration. We've got Rahu, Ketu running through the 6th and 12th houses. Rahu is debilitated in Taurus, Ketu exalted in Scorpio, and the moon is debilitated in the 12th house. Looking ahead, I mean, this is going to maybe cause some problems with the population, the people in general in Russia. But when we look at any prashna or muhurta, we're looking at the ascendant as being indicative of he who asks the question or launches the campaign. We look at lagnesh as being indicative of that same person. In this case, because it's Sagittarius rising, that'll be Jupiter. So we've got the ascendant in Sagittarius. Venus and Mars, because they occupy the ascendant, will be representative of Russia. Jupiter, because it is the lord of the ascendant, will also represent Russia. And last but not least, the moon, which is representative of, the querent in Prashna, or the principal agent in a muhurta will all be representative of Russia. And as we'll see, all of these are in pretty compromised circumstances. So let's start with the ascendant. So you have Sagittarius ascendant, and here you have Venus and Mars in the ascendant. Now, there's no problem in that, but look at the degree positions. Venus is at 2739, Mars is at 2816. So if you do the math, that is less than 1 degree of longitude between the two of them. This is Graha Yuddha, planetary war. Now, we can, attempt to determine technically, who's the winner of this, but, sometimes that's a bit of a thorny issue. Usually what is involved is considerations of brightness. Venus is almost always brighter than Mars. We could say that Venus would win in that respect. Altitude, Venus is higher in the sky than Mars is, and so by that score it would be winning that particular war as well too. But speed is the other factor. And as it turns out, Mars in this era, I gave another presentation, what was it called, the Transit Summit, sometime earlier in the year, back in January or February, part of a group of people. And in it I discussed how Mars was moving very, very quickly, really at a high rate of speed. And because of that, Mars is very much a contender for powerful battle here between Venus and Mars. And, the bottom line on all this is we need not worry at the end of the day who is the winner of this war, but what happens when two planets are both with evident strengths. Then this can become a little bit of a heavyweight fight between, two very powerful contenders who go the whole 12 rounds with no knockouts and basically must score on points perhaps to win. At the end of that fight, both combatants are severely punished, such that at the end nobody really feels like a winner. Well, we're going to see what happens in this particular war, but just from an astrological point of view, there's something of that right there, where the planetary war between two, pretty much matched combatants in the ascendant is a very poor sign for Russia, because this is, their war that they created. They could have avoided, but they created, and now they're going to have to pay the penalty in some regard. So, think back on what was going on. Venus had been in a very lengthy 5-week retrograde cycle that had begun back around the 20th of December in 2021. And that continued up until 30th of January 2022, when Venus went stationary direct and then began, a slow forward crawl. Meanwhile, Mars sort of came out of the backfield, if you like, moving very quickly and overtook Venus. And actually, around February 11th, entered into a technical planetary war with Venus, technically, being within 1 degree of longitude. Slowly, Mars overtook Venus, and on February 16th, they were exactly conjunct. And then Mars moved on ahead, and then Venus eventually picked up speed, as is normal. And, of course, its regular rate of speed is faster than Mars. So eventually it too caught up with Mars around March the 6th. And then for, that's the exact conjunction. And then it took a while for it to get ahead. March 13th, I think, by the time Venus was 1 degree ahead of Mars. And eventually that planetary war ended. But just to recap, there was a period there from February 11th until March 13th where this planetary war between Venus and Mars was full blown. That's a very lengthy planetary war, and as I say, it's a consequence of Venus having come out of a retrograde period, being very slow, Mars overtaking it, then Venus resuming its normal speed, overtaking Mars, and then getting on a hit. So this is very problematic, a planetary war of long-standing duration, and this particular launch of this war, um, February 24th, happened right in the middle of that lengthy planetary war between Venus and Mars. So, this is quite problematic. Now, take a look at, the lordship in this particular chart. Venus is the lord of the 6th, Atrikashtana. Mars is the lord of the 12th, Atrikashtana. Now, there is a rule in the formation of Viparita Raja Yoga that if the lords of two Trikashtanas form association or mutual aspect in any house and are absent the influence of any other planet, they can form Viparita Raja Yoga. And this can be a kind of overturning of circumstances. Call it, two negatives make a positive. But the bottom line on the evaluation of this is that one or the other of those two planets must have some essential strength. They either have to be in their, sign of exaltation, they have to have Digbala, one of them has to have retrogression, or one of them has to be Swa Nakshatra. If you examine these two, none of those is happening. Venus and Mars are ordinary in Sagittarius. Neither has retrogression. Neither has Digbala. There's a close call here. If Venus were like just 1 degree earlier, it would have been Swa Nakshatra. But it's out of that range. Venus's range to be Swa Nakshatra is 1320 to 2640 of a fire sign. That's come and gone. Venus at 2739 is out of its own nakshatra. So that's not happening. So basically what you have is not only a planetary war, you have two trick lords occupying the ascendant. This is pretty awful. Okay, we're just beginning. I can't stress how terrible a muhurta this is. So Sagittarius rising. So then the next thing we're going to look at is Lagnesh Jupiter. So follow the trail. Here's Jupiter occupying the 3rd house. Well, 3rd house can represent courage, acts of war, adventurism, if you like. Yeah, that's all well and good. But does Jupiter have any strength in so doing? Well, Jupiter in Aquarius is meaningless. That has no dignity. That's actually in a nakshatra of Rahu. Furthermore, look at what's going on here. Jupiter we can consider as being essentially stationary. Meanwhile, the Sun at 1117 degrees of Aquarius is moving forward, and in, roughly 7.5 degrees time, 7 degrees 14 minutes, the Sun will close with Jupiter and provide combustion to that Jupiter. Well, if this is my ascendant, I don't want that, because this is, Jupiter is Lagnesh for the Sagittarius ascendant, which represents, Russia, the aggressor, the one, launching this campaign. So this is not good news. So in roughly 7 degrees, this is already wide combustion, and as the days go by, it will only get worse. So let's just note that 7 degrees and 14 minutes of arc, in which the Sun will perfectly close with Jupiter and provide total combustion. In other words, Jupiter will become toast in 7 degrees. Then, last but not least, have a look at the moon, which is also a significator of, the principle in this particular launch of activities, which again we consider to be Russia. So the moon is, it's relatively dark and waning. That's not such a consideration here because it's not really that dark. It's at its quarter cycle, a quarter moon. But the moon is debilitated and the moon is in the 12th house. Both of those are, poor indicators for any kind of success. And as the moon progresses, moves forward day by day by day, actually in about 7 days, the moon will be a new moon and will close with Jupiter. And so that will really solidify this whole notion of, 7 days or 7 units of time will be instrumental in seeing this particular adventure, come to some sort of sorry end. So the moon, again, debilitated in the 12th house and in the company of a powerful Chaya Graha. The moon is on the Rahu Ketu axis. And that's certainly not a good place for the moon to be. So this doesn't bode well for Russia or for the Russian people as well. And so as time has gone by, we've seen, one misery after another for the Russians. If we look at 7 days out, because basically the sun will move forward. Actually, it takes a bit more than 7 days for the sun to close that gap. Although it's 7 degrees and 14 minutes, it takes something more like 8 days for the sun to close that gap perfectly with Jupiter. But look at what happened. Roughly from 7 days from the onset of the war, which would have taken us to March 1st or 2nd. February only has 28 days. So 4 days out is the 28th, and 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. It would be around March 3rd, March 4th. So around about that time, you had that long line of vehicles trying to, a support convoy stalled on the road to Kiev and basically sitting ducks for all kinds of Ukrainian bombardment with artillery, drones, and basically, they characterized it as Russian soldiers, parked in refrigerators because a lot of these vehicles didn't have proper heat and ran out of gas while trying to keep warm and therefore immobilized. So around about a week out, the Russians stalled. They could not get any closer to Kiev. They were getting met with fierce Ukrainian resistance. Their supply convoy was stalled and being disrupted. That was the first of major failures for the Russian campaign. So that's the 7-day marker. Interestingly enough, if you take this 7 degrees and change and we translate it into 7 weeks of time, an interesting thing happened 7 weeks out. This was the Ukrainian use of Neptune anti-shipping missiles, and they sank, the Russians' flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, this major battle cruiser by the name of Moskva. They hit it with 2 Neptune missiles and sunk it. And this was such a major blow for Russia that they still can't admit it. They still can't talk about it. They pretended that something else happened, that a fire broke out, that a storm came up in the Black Sea, and that the ship was damaged and towed back to port. Meanwhile, mothers and fathers of sailors are asking, where the heck are our sons? And basically they can thus far only declare that some are missing and presumed dead. And the sad reality is that there are probably hundreds dead. And this is a loss of a major naval ship. So that's another major turn of the war. And as it drags on, it doesn't look good. Now the Ukrainians are pushing back very hard. The Russians have retreated from Kyiv. They've mobilized all their troops in the east, in the Donbass and Donetsk regions, and they're doing what they can there. But even that's not going good. The Ukrainians are pushing back. So now we begin to wonder, how long could this war last? Well, I'm going to go back again to this Sun and Jupiter and 7 degrees and 14 minutes of arc between the launch of this battle, this campaign, this war, and what we might regard as something of a pivotal point. Now, lots of pundits are saying, Russia is settling down for a very long and a bitter war, but how long can they last? Because as more and more news of this leaks out, there's going to be a lot of blowback on the domestic front. Already it's happening that, sanctions of the economic sort are beginning to mount up, and, food and groceries, etc., and all kinds of consumer goods are beginning to disappear from shelves. Western companies are closing down and leaving Russia. The people are starting to get wind of the fact that there is a real war in Ukraine. It's not going well. There is allegedly something like 30,000 Russian troops, perhaps dead. A third of all Russian troops committed are now dead or seriously wounded and out of commission. It's looking really bad. How can they continue? So about 7 months out, and where does that get us? Somewheres into the latter part of September would technically be 7 months out from the onset of this. And then you might very well see, well, we just don't know. Serious political protests and unrest, even within the inner circle of Putin, as is much discussed now. He is allegedly ill with any number of things, blood cancer, Parkinson's, thyroid disease, dementia. There's a whole lot of things being bandied about. Separately, years ago, I did an analysis of Putin, and I won't put up his chart now because I don't want to turn this into too lengthy of a discussion. But he, the time I'm using for him is a little bit speculative, rectified by some methodology using the amshas, which I go into in this post. If you Google Putin, the spy who came home with the gold, this was a post I wrote back in 2018. The prognosis at the end is probably incorrect because I saw him, perhaps thriving. In hindsight now, I'm looking at, quite possibly serious illness, if not incapacitation, with the onset of his Mercury dasha in December. Well, with these major dashas, he's been running a Saturn dasha, and as he transitions into Mercury, the period of transition for these major dashas can literally be months at a time, so we don't want to hang too much of weight on the notion of a change of dasha in December. Anytime in the second half of 2022 could be when he starts to see things, fall apart for him. We need not even allude to that. It just happens that I have looked at his chart in the past and discussed it on my website. Back to this, it seems, pretty evident in hindsight that this is a miserable muhurta, and it's got these inflection points, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months out, that look pretty poor for the whole Russian campaign. So we'll see. Good luck to Zelensky and the Ukrainians. They have put up a massive fight. Obviously, they're very well motivated, and they're really heroes in every respect in this, unjust war. Okay, so just a little bit of a recap on this whole thing. Looking back on this season, it's really been quite extraordinary in light of planetary war, Graha Yuddha. This is an era in which Mars has been moving very, very briskly, almost at peak speed. And during this season, we've had a planetary war between Venus and Mars. that lasted a little bit more than a month, from February 11th until March 13th. And of course, the onset of this war happened during that time. And then on April 4th, Mars and Saturn came to a perfect conjunction, and for a day on either side of that formed another planetary war. And of course, this is two, great malefics. And not only was Mars moving very fast for its, compared to its average rate of speed, but Mars was in Capricorn, where it's exalted and, very powerful, if you like, as a warrior. Meanwhile, Saturn was in Capricorn as well, too, where it too is very strong. And Saturn, whether you look at it as a karaka for destruction or death or whatever, the two together are really, problematic. Back in whenever that was, late January or early February, when I was part of a group discussing, transits for 2022, I talked about the Mars-Saturn conjunction or planetary war that was coming at the time, and, alluded to the many possibilities that could occur, including war, including war crimes, including, severe stock market corrections and all the rest of that. But just on the point of the war, Mars and Saturn are pretty awful when they are in war, because they're, of antithetical nature, and yet both powerful in the sign of Capricorn. And I haven't looked back to see, but, the war crimes that were committed in Bucha and other locations in Ukraine, as the Russians began to, retreat in frustration and, take their frustration out on the civilian population in Ukraine. I haven't looked back to see the dates of those, but I wouldn't be surprised if the first week of April saw, something of a heightened period as far as rape and looting and the many war crimes that have occurred at the hands of the Russian invaders. So, a big picture on all this is that this was a terrible timing for the launch of a war. I mean, in many ways, it now seems that Russia was very, very ill prepared for this. But their timing seems to have been really miserable. And perhaps, the very launch of the war and the very miserable muhurta that this represents is merely symptomatic of an underlying malaise that existed within Russian culture of, corruption and lack of morale, an ugly war going into it right from the get-go. So all in all, it's really a very poor muhurta. Planetary war in the ascendant Lord Jupiter, submitting to combustion within a week of launch. The moon debilitated in the 12th house, lying on the axis of a Kala Sarpa chart. It's like you almost couldn't have picked a worse launch date for a war. So if there's a lesson to be learned from this, when you're ready to go for war, pick a good muhurta. Learn your lesson, Mr. Putin, but I don't think you're going to get a second chance. Okay, that's it for today.